Welcome to the podcast, David.
Hi, Jackie.
Now, this was a very interesting week for the Voice debate. We saw a bit more heat on the No campaign than we've seen previously, and we saw particularly a split between the opposition leader, Peter Dutton, and the lead No campaigner, Warren Mundine, over the issue of treaty. Can you tell us what happened?
Yes, it basically started with Warren Mundine, key figure in the No side, saying that in his view, there was a pathway toward treaties with Indigenous Australians in the event of a no vote. So he really presented a no vote as a way in which you could start discussing treaties. Now, this is incredibly contentious because a lot of people on the no side just totally rule out the idea of treaties. And it was another example of the fracturing of the debate around the Voice. So Warren Mundine said, not a national treaty, but there would be a place for treaties with different Indigenous Australians. And I think it reflects a reality out there. A lot of different Indigenous groups, there's no one-size-fits-all for them. And maybe the idea of a national treaty doesn't actually suit some of them. Fair enough. But of course, that was totally at odds with what Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price, another leader of the No campaign, is putting forward, which is, against treaties, and totally at odds with the campaign being run by Peter Dutton, who doesn't want treaties, doesn't want to spend money on treaties, and is a hard no to that, and really says, as part of the fundamental campaign, that if you vote for the Voice, you're voting for treaties. Well, Warren Mundine's remarks were clear evidence that if you vote against the Voice, you can also be voting for treaties as well. And it highlights just how all over the shop fractured this debate is, because we have Lydia Thorpe, former Greens senator, saying vote no because we want treaties and sovereignty. Warren Mundine saying vote no and there'll be a pathway toward treaties. Peter Dutton saying vote no and vote no to treaties. Jacinta Price saying vote no and saying no to treaties. Meanwhile, on the yes side, there are yes advocates who want the Voice to help negotiate treaties. And there are those on the yes side, like Anthony Albanese, who are saying it's not about treaties. I can understand why voters would be switching off, would be getting quite jaded with this entire debate where they see so many conflicting messages, let alone the outright lies that are spreading on social media. So it's been, in my view, a week of sort of lack of enlightenment, lack of progress in the referendum on the Voice. There's been not really a lot of shifting. There have been some news stories that are interesting, but it hasn't shown, I think, momentum on one side or the other this week.
A lot of people, as you say, would be confused or confounded by the talk of a treaty. When people talk about treaty or treaty making, what exactly are they talking about? And I did note that the New South Wales budget released this week sets aside $5 million for a 12-month consultation process with Aboriginal communities to, quote, inform a pathway to treaty. So this is something the states are already getting on with, isn't it?
Yes, and Queensland has got a similar pathway where they're talking about this kind of resolution between the state.
And Victoria, I think, is on the same pathway. And if I'm not mistaken, I think South Australia already has a treaty, doesn't it?
And certainly has a pathway toward a Voice.
Yep.
So these things are all being done at a state level. And I think that's an appropriate thing to acknowledge, because a lot of it is about state power. State governments are sovereign in their own right as well. And so if they want to sign treaties with Indigenous Australians, they have that right. And that's actually a good forum in which to debate that. But I think fundamentally that shows there is not anything good, bad, necessarily all downside or upside with having an argument about treaties. I think no matter what the outcome of this referendum, there will be discussions about treaties in the future. But I do think that it is maddeningly, frustratingly imprecise for Australian voters. What would the treaty achieve in a concrete way for Indigenous Australians? They're often talked about in abstract terms rather than in terms that matter in a practical way. And I think time and again we find in this Voice debate people shift towards the academic discussion about what might happen in a hypothetical future and move the attention away from what the Voice is meant to be about: closing the gap, helping education, helping on health, helping on those incarceration rates, and doing something practical. And time and again, that debate is lost in all the other argument that is held.
Yeah, I guess Warren Mundine's comments this week show that no matter whether the no case gets up or the yes case gets up, talking about treaty is not going to go away. I want to ask you, though, do you think the fracturing of the No campaign on this issue is going to harm their campaign?
I think it could. It could because it shows a lack of a clear message. Up until now, the no side has been very clear, very disciplined with their message. And that didn't happen this week. It's usually the yes side that is talking with a dozen messages that are all different, without clear discipline and with fewer leaders and with some people on the yes side saying things in public that don't actually help the campaign. Now we're seeing some of that happen on the no side because they're under greater scrutiny. Questions are asked. Information is volunteered. Warren Mundine said what he actually thinks. He also said that, he would move Australia Day. Now, to some people on the no side, that's anathema. So there's starting to be a bit more scrutiny. It could trouble the no side, but I do think that Warren Mundine doesn't have the profile of Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price. When she spoke to the National Press Club last week, I think that her remarks really resonated with people because she was saying things that a lot of people want to believe are true. And so I think that message is still going to be cutting through.
This week, we also saw Cathy Freeman put out a very heartfelt ad for the Yes campaign, imploring Australians to back the Voice. And then last Sunday, we saw tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands of people march in support of the Voice all across Australia and even in some overseas locations. Would you say it's been a good week for the Yes campaign?
I think it's been an okay week, but they need to do better. They're the ones who are behind, and they're the ones who need to do something significant and dramatic to turn the tables. So that's where the onus lies in this campaign. Just firstly on those marches, I think the marches were effective for the Yes campaign. It showed popular support. It showed people power. That's really important. They've got that, whereas the No camp tends to be a smaller group. They don't mobilise on the street in the same way. I have talked to people in government who have a few reservations about the marches because they thought that they were preaching to the converted. They're not sure that was really reaching a lot of other people. But there are opinions to and fro on that. I do think that there was an issue with the Cathy Freeman endorsement. We knew this was coming. We couldn't get interviews with Cathy Freeman because this was arranged that she would come out with an endorsement at a timing of their choosing. And I'm dumbfounded at the way they did it. Now, I haven't written about this. I'm not going to go into print on an analysis piece about it, but I think it's worth touching on here. That story was meant to make a splash in the News Corp tabloids. It was buried. That night we heard about it. We tried to write a story. We couldn't get clear information from the Yes campaign about this endorsement by Cathy Freeman. So we were late in getting the story out. We got it online on the night. It did not have the impact that it should have had. And that was a media management issue. I don't want to spend this entire referendum talking about political tactics on the yes and no side, but this is one case where if you've got Cathy Freeman, you've got to maximise the impact. And I don't think that they did that. And I don't understand why they can't manage that kind of campaign tactic better.
Yeah, it definitely goes to the organisation and the media management of the Yes campaign, which I'm sure will be the subject of post-mortems in the aftermath. I want to segue now to the post-Voice landscape, which we predict will be dominated by discussion of the economy and immigration relatedly. And for that discussion, we want to bring in our special guest star for the week, economics correspondent Rachel Clun. Rach, welcome.
Lovely to be with you.
Do we have a fanfare there? Is there a fanfare that we press
She
the
needs
button
some
on?
sort of special radio sting or something, a little theme song. We'll get one for next time. No, I want to ask both of you just quickly, the government's been criticised by the opposition for neglecting Australians who are impacted by the cost of living crisis while it focuses on the Voice debate. Do you think that's a fair criticism, Rach? You write in this area.
Well, look, I've been very focused on all things cost of living and economy, and certainly Treasurer Jim Chalmers has been trying to talk about cost of living, budget pressures, wage growth, all that sort of stuff. Is it cutting through the Voice debate? I'm not sure that that's the case, but they are putting out things that in a way to kind of set a different scene. So next week we're going to get their employment white paper, which kind of sets up the government's plan for improving jobs, improving skills and all that sort of thing. And that's also ahead of the migration review, and we'll get some policy announcements out of that as well. So I think they are trying to do some things in the lead up to the Voice to say we're not just focused on this, we're looking at these other really important issues as well.
Yeah, Treasurer Jim Chalmers has talked about the employment white paper in terms of, managing the big structural shifts in the employment economy, moving towards full employment while also managing inflation. It's very difficult, I would say, just as a casual observer, to get a handle on whether or not the economy is actually doing well at the moment. I know there was an OECD report out this week which you wrote about, and it had some pretty lacklustre predictions about Australia's growth and didn't have great things to say about underlying inflation. What exactly is the economic outlook that Jim Chalmers is dealing with? What are the different pressures on the economy that he needs to manage?
In short, it's really mixed and it's quite uncertain. So you mentioned the OECD report. It predicts that the Australian economy will have grown by 1.8% this year. To put it in perspective, the average growth yearly growth in Australia before the pandemic was 2.6%. So that's a lot lower. Inflation is still high. People are still really struggling with those rising costs. But on the other hand, we've also got a really extraordinarily strong jobs market at the moment. We've got unemployment at 3.7%. So there are these really strange mixed signals from within the economy, and then you go out and then we've got these risks from, China's deceleration and their teetering property market. It's very uncertain at the moment.
David, there is a backdrop of uncertainty. We've got the employment white paper out on Monday. Employment white papers are not renowned for their sexiness, but I'm sure you guys will manage to make it sexy. What do you expect to see out of that employment white paper in terms of policy direction?
There has to be a direction to full employment, which is their stated goal. The early indications are that Jim Chalmers wants this to be the goal of the employment white paper. So let's see what they produce on Monday that tells us how we're going to get there. I think there's a conflict here because they talk about full employment, and yet at the same time, in response to the OECD report that Rachel talked about, Jim Chalmers acknowledges there's going to be an increase in unemployment, isn't there? But we can question the scale of that increase, but that's right, isn't it?
The really odd thing about full employment is most predictions have it as above what the unemployment rate currently is. So probably about 4.5% is the rate of full employment. And that's where you have the only type of employment you have in a full employment scenario is people who are out of work because they are between jobs, not because they don't have the skills. And so that's kind of, and not because there's a recession as well. So that's kind of the ideal type of employment. But yeah, implicit in that is the fact that employment will go up if we want to reach full employment.
Exactly, exactly. So there is a bit of a tension there in what he's promising, but it does hint at some hardship to come. And I think that some of the things that are missing in this employment debate are, well, where are the new jobs going to come from? Are we really looking at a scenario where we can afford higher wages for all the jobs that are created? Are wage expectations going to be realistic? We've had this strong message from the government that they are about lifting wages. They must be about wage growth. But at the same time, you've got the business community saying, well, in order to have wage growth, you actually need productivity. You need a broader plan that shows how the economy is going to perform better. And I think some of that has been missing. And I'm not sure that that's going to be part of the employment white paper, but I think some economists would argue that it should be.
I want to link this to the migration review because, the government came in and basically has really put a ruler through the entire migration system. They've said that the migration system is broken. They've been conducting this review. We'll see the results of that review soon. Ahead of that, or related to that, business wants more skilled migrants to come in and fill what it says are skills shortages. And I saw that the Australian Financial Review ran a story this week about the government, being expected to bring in a fast-track visa program for skilled migrants on $120,000 or more. We'll know more details of this soon. But I just wondered what you thought of that, David, and whether or not increasing the migrant intake in this way or in any way is going to be politically tricky for Labor, and also how the opposition is likely to place itself in the politics of that.
The politics are going to become very clear, and I'm writing about this in my column as a phony debate on Big Australia, because this is not about increasing the migrant intake over and above what's already happening due to forces that are huge in the wake of the pandemic. We know that the migrant intake is going up this year and next. That forecast is already out there. The migration strategy is not about adding to that increase. And just because there's a visa class to encourage highly skilled workers doesn't mean that it's open slather. It's actually about being selective about who comes in, because they want to maximise the economic benefit. That's a struggle for the government to communicate. That's their challenge. They've got to explain how that's going to work. I think that it is falling into place in a relatively coherent way. But the response from the opposition is already clear. They say it's Big Australia by stealth. That's going to be their line. They're going to go to the next election warning that Labor has, allowed too many people to come in. But one of the fundamental challenges we have here is that we have what the politicians keep calling a demand-driven migration system. I mean, that basically means that if the universities want to bring in overseas students, which are fundamental to their business model in one of the nation's biggest export sectors, then they can, as long as they meet the safeguards on visa applications. There's no cap nationally for how many students the universities should be able to bring in. But I think there's got to be a debate about that. To what extent is a demand-driven system an uncapped system? Because at some point you do get pressure on infrastructure, on housing from this growth. The growth of the university sector has been good. Australia has benefited from it. But at what point do you start thinking about stronger integrity checks? And stronger integrity checks are part of this migration strategy.
Just quickly, I want to touch on the COVID inquiry, which was announced this week by the Prime Minister. That's an inquiry into Australia's response to the pandemic. This is something Labor did promise that it would do if it won government, and now it's come good. But does anyone want to revisit those dark old days? And is there any political upside for the government in doing this, Rach?
Well, as someone who was a health reporter when the pandemic started, I can't say I'm particularly excited to revisit it. But it's really important, right? I mean, I remember at the very start of 2020, health authorities around the world were caught with their pants down, essentially. No one was prepared. Hospitals were kind of strained at the time anyway. We didn't have stockpiles of essential medical equipment. We thought, our supply chains were secure, and all of that was upended within months. So I think it's really important to look at what happened and how we can prepare better for the next pandemic, as I'm sure there will be another one, unfortunately. Is this inquiry going to look at some of the issues that it needs to? I think it misses a big chunk of the problem with not including states in the inquiry. The Prime Minister said, well, there's been 20 reports already about this issue, but this is a chance to look at it from a national perspective and look at what states did and didn't do that, maybe could have been done better, and how that worked from a coordinated national level. And I think that's a bit of a miss.
David, what do you think? The lockdowns were hands down probably the most controversial part of the pandemic response. They were the responsibility of the states, and they're going to be missed in this inquiry.
One of the challenges here is that I don't think structurally it is really a good idea for a federal government to launch investigations into state governments. I think that we are a federation whether we like it or not. Changing that structure of the federation is incredibly challenging. You could come up with any number of imagined ways to do it differently, but this is the way it is. And to set up a group in Canberra who are going to start inquiring into Victoria, New South Wales, WA, Queensland, when it's not their jurisdiction, I think is challenging, and I'm not sure that it would work. I think that there's a place for the states themselves to do inquiries into their own decisions because it's their jurisdiction, it's their voters who were affected. You know, voters in Melbourne should want their state government to have a look at what worked and what did not. But I also think, I'm not saying that a small inquiry is a good answer. I think if we can have a Royal Commission into Robodebt, a Royal Commission into bushfires, a huge disaster, we can certainly have a Royal Commission into COVID, which arguably was a bigger disaster globally. And so I think it looks to me like an inquiry that the government doesn't really feel strongly about. They're not announcing it in a way that makes you feel they really want it.
They said that they wanted to do this when they were in opposition. They didn't have to promise it. Why promise it? And why is there little enthusiasm about it? Is it because there's no political dividend for them?
Labor was in a bit of a bind on this because before the last election, a Labor-dominated Senate committee led by Katie Gallagher, who's now the finance minister, said there should be a Royal Commission. Anthony Albanese, as opposition leader, said multiple times there should be an inquiry. He did not explicitly promise a Royal Commission. I think that's really important. But he did promise an inquiry. So he's keeping an election promise, but he's doing it late. I mean, this should have been done 6 months ago, maybe a year ago. And he's also doing it in what looks like a half-hearted way. And he's doing it in a way that maintains total control. A really key thing here is the 3 members of this committee report to the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. The task force is run out of Anthony Albanese's department. So there will be central control. I've seen various words used to describe this. Deep, thorough, well, maybe. Independent? No. Don't use that word to describe this inquiry.
That's a good note to end on, I think. I'm sure we'll come back to the subject. And guys, I really appreciate you both joining us for today's podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks, Jackie.
Nice to be here.